Welcome back to Brian Case Records, where we examine the facts, follow the evidence, and separate what is known from what remains unanswered. Few cases in recent months have generated as much public attention as the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells. What began as a holiday outing with friends on Mississippi's Horn Island has evolved into an investigation followed closely across social media, local communities, and national news. Weeks after Nolan's body was recovered, the case continues to raise difficult questions, not simply because of how events unfolded that day, but because of the conflicting accounts that followed. Now, another development has added a new layer to the public conversation. A recently circulated photograph has sparked widespread discussion online. Some people believe it offers additional context about the relationships within the group that spent July 4th together. Others argue the image proves nothing at all and serves only to fuel speculation. At this stage, investigators have not publicly stated that the photograph changes the direction of the investigation or establishes a motive. Even so, the image has become another focal point in a case already filled with unanswered questions. Today, we're going to examine what is documented, what has been publicly reported, and what remains unresolved. We'll also look at why so many people continue asking whether key details from that day have yet to be fully explained. If you appreciate fact-based true crime investigations that separate verified information from online speculation, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Brian Case Records, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. To understand why this case has captured so much attention, it's important to go back to the beginning. On July 4th, Nolan Wells joined a large group of young adults traveling to Horn Island, one of Mississippi's barrier islands located in the Gulf of Mexico. For many on the Gulf Coast, the island is a familiar destination during holiday weekends. Friends gather there by boat to swim, socialize, and spend the day on the water before returning to the mainland in the evening. By multiple public accounts, several boats traveled to the island that morning carrying more than 20 people. Nolan was among them. At first, nothing about the trip appeared unusual. Friends have described the atmosphere as relaxed, with people moving between boats, talking, swimming, and spending time together throughout the afternoon. But somewhere between the arrival at Horn Island and the return trip home, something changed. Exactly what happened during those hours remains the central mystery of this investigation. One of the earliest challenges for investigators, and for the public trying to understand the case, has been the number of different timelines that emerged after Nolan disappeared. Various witnesses have publicly described seeing Nolan at different points during the afternoon. Some accounts generally align. Others differ on important details, including when he was last seen and where he intended to go before the boats departed. Those differences do not necessarily mean anyone is being dishonest. Memories can change under stressful circumstances, particularly after a traumatic event. But when investigators attempt to reconstruct the final hours of someone's life, even small inconsistencies become important. As public interest in the case grew, another development brought renewed attention. A recorded emergency call connected to a boating incident began circulating online. Audio engineers, content creators, and thousands of social media users started listening repeatedly, attempting to determine exactly what could be heard in the background. Some listeners believed they recognized certain words or names. Others reached completely different conclusions after hearing the same recording. Experts have long cautioned that audio interpretation can be influenced by expectation. Once someone is told what they are supposed to hear, the brain often begins filling in sounds that may not actually be distinguishable. For that reason, interpretations circulating online should not be treated as established facts unless confirmed by investigators or supported by additional evidence. Still, the recording became one of the most discussed pieces of material connected to the case. It wasn't only the words people believed they heard. It was the timing. Questions quickly followed. If Nolan had remained on the island after the boats left, how should the recording be understood? If he had already separated from the group, why were some listeners convinced they heard references to him? Were those interpretations accurate, or had a heavily analyzed recording taken on a life of its own? At this point, investigators have not publicly confirmed many of the specific claims circulating online regarding the recording. Even so, the discussion surrounding the audio dramatically increased public scrutiny of the investigation. As people revisited interviews given by those who were present that day, attention naturally shifted toward the individuals who had been with Nolan during the outing. Several friends have spoken publicly about the events of July 4th. Their interviews have provided important context, but they have also generated additional questions from viewers attempting to reconcile different recollections of the day. Among the names frequently mentioned in those interviews is Bart. Public records and interviews indicate that Bart and Nolan knew each other before July 4th. Both had ties to Ocean Springs football, and Bart later continued his athletic career at the collegiate level as a punter. In the weeks following Nolan's death, Bart publicly expressed sympathy for Nolan's family and said he wanted the facts to come out. Despite those statements, his name continued appearing in online discussions, largely because other witnesses referenced him while describing the events of that day. More recently, another layer of discussion emerged after a photograph began circulating online. Almost immediately, social media users began debating what the image might mean. Some suggested it reflected previously unknown dynamics within the friend group. Others argued the photograph was being interpreted far beyond what it actually showed. It's important to emphasize that investigators have not publicly stated that the photograph establishes any romantic relationship, explains a motive, or changes the known facts of the investigation. Nevertheless, because the image became widely shared, it influenced the public conversation surrounding the case. One lesson repeated throughout major investigations is that online narratives often evolve much faster than official investigations. A single photograph, a brief video clip, an isolated text message. Each can become the center of intense debate within hours, but context matters. Without corroborating evidence, isolated images rarely tell the complete story. That hasn't stopped thousands of people from trying to understand whether the photograph fits into the larger timeline of July 4th. For investigators, however, photographs are evaluated alongside witness interviews, digital evidence, location data, forensic findings, and many other pieces of information that may never become public while an investigation remains active. As the case continued receiving widespread attention, law enforcement repeatedly emphasized that certain details could not yet be released because of the ongoing investigation and grand jury process. That public restraint frustrated many observers. Some interpreted the silence as evidence that something significant was happening behind the scenes. Others viewed it simply as standard investigative procedure. Regardless of which interpretation people favored, one fact remained unchanged. The investigation was continuing, and every new public development, including interviews, audio recordings, photographs, and official statements, was being examined through the lens of a timeline that still contained unanswered questions. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." I want to know who's following this case closely. And if you're enjoying this fact-based breakdown, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Brian Case Records. The more investigators work to piece together Nolan Wells's final hours, the more attention turned toward the timeline itself. In many investigations, a reliable timeline becomes the foundation for everything that follows. It helps establish where people were, when key events occurred, and whether different accounts can be reconciled with available evidence. In Nolan's case, that timeline has remained one of the most closely examined aspects of the investigation. According to publicly available information, multiple boats traveled to Horn Island on the morning of July 4th. The holiday is traditionally one of the busiest days of the year along Mississippi's Gulf Coast, and Horn Island is a popular destination for groups spending the day on the water. Friends gathered, boats anchored near one another, and people moved between different groups throughout the afternoon. From the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary holiday outing. No one could have predicted that, by the following day, search crews would be looking for an 18-year-old who had not returned home. As the investigation unfolded, witnesses began sharing their recollections with law enforcement. Some later chose to speak publicly through interviews or social media. Those statements offered pieces of the puzzle, but they also demonstrated how difficult it can be to reconstruct a fast-moving day involving dozens of people. One consistent point across many accounts is that Nolan was seen interacting with friends throughout the day. Several witnesses described him as social and in good spirits. Like many others on the island, he spent time talking, swimming, and moving between different areas where people had gathered. Where the accounts become more complicated is near the end of the afternoon. Exactly when Nolan was last seen, and under what circumstances, has been the subject of significant public discussion. Some individuals have stated that Nolan intended to remain on the island for a period of time. Others have described seeing him shortly before boats began preparing to leave. These accounts have been widely discussed, but investigators have not publicly released a complete reconstruction of Nolan's final confirmed movements. That gap has left room for public debate, though it is important to remember that unanswered questions are not, by themselves, evidence of wrongdoing. As public interest intensified, interviews given by people who were on the island received renewed attention. Viewers listened carefully, comparing one statement to another, searching for details that might clarify the timeline. In several interviews, witnesses described seeing Nolan spending time with a young woman identified publicly as Katie. Those interactions have become part of the public conversation because they help establish who was with Nolan during portions of the day. Beyond that, however, investigators have not publicly identified those interactions as evidence of a motive or criminal conduct. Despite that, social media discussions quickly expanded beyond the verified facts. Images, comments, and screenshots circulated widely, with many people attempting to interpret relationships within the larger friend group. While those conversations have become a major part of the online narrative, they should not be confused with official findings. As with many high-profile cases, the internet often moves faster than the investigation itself. A photograph can circulate around the world in minutes. A short clip from an interview can generate thousands of comments within hours. An isolated statement can be repeated so many times that people begin treating it as established fact, even when investigators have never confirmed it. That appears to be one of the challenges surrounding the Nolan Wells case. Alongside the witness interviews, another piece of evidence drew widespread public attention: the emergency boating call that has been analyzed repeatedly by content creators and members of the public. When portions of the recording became more widely available, people began listening for every possible detail. Some believed they could identify voices. Others believed they heard names being spoken in the background. Additional audio enhancements were later shared online by independent editors attempting to isolate voices from surrounding noise. Those enhanced recordings quickly became the focus of intense discussion. However, audio experts have long warned that enhancement techniques can improve clarity only to a certain extent. Once heavy processing is applied, listeners may begin interpreting sounds differently, especially if they already expect to hear specific words or names. That is why investigators generally evaluate recordings alongside other forms of evidence, rather than relying solely on public interpretations. To date, officials have not publicly validated many of the specific claims circulating online about what can allegedly be heard on the recording. Even so, the audio remains one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it raises questions about the sequence of events during the return from Horn Island. Another issue that has received considerable attention involves the reported boat locations. As independent researchers and members of the public reviewed maps and available navigation data, they began comparing reported coordinates with water depth charts for the surrounding area. Some questioned whether publicly discussed locations appeared consistent with descriptions that circulated afterward. Others argued there were reasonable explanations based on tides, boat movement, weather conditions, or incomplete information available to the public. Without access to the full investigative file, however, outside observers are working with only a portion of the available evidence. Investigators may possess interviews, digital records, forensic examinations, photographs, or other materials that have never been released publicly. That distinction is important. Public discussion often focuses on the evidence people can see. Investigators must evaluate both public and non-public evidence before reaching conclusions. As weeks passed, another significant development occurred. The Jackson County District Attorney publicly addressed questions surrounding the pace of the investigation. While acknowledging the community's desire for answers, the office explained that Mississippi's legal process limits what prosecutors can publicly discuss, while an investigation and grand jury proceedings remain active. For many members of the public, that explanation was understandable. For others, it only increased frustration. Families seeking answers naturally want information as quickly as possible. Communities following a high-profile case often feel the same way, but criminal investigations rarely unfold according to public expectations. Evidence must be verified, witnesses must be interviewed, digital records must be analyzed, forensic examinations take time, and investigators must ensure that any future legal proceedings are not compromised by the premature release of information. Those realities can make periods of silence feel especially difficult, particularly when online conversations continue around the clock. Yet throughout that silence, one thing has remained constant. Nolan Wells' family has continued seeking answers about what happened on July 4th. Supporters have continued following developments closely, and investigators have continued their work away from public view. Each new interview, each newly released document, and each official statement has added another piece to a case that remains under active examination. What happened during those final hours on Horn Island is still the question at the center of this investigation. The answer, investigators have indicated, must come from evidence, not assumptions. As this investigation continues, one thing has become increasingly clear. The story of Nolan Wells did not end when search crews located him. In many ways, that discovery marked the beginning of a much larger effort to understand exactly what happened during the final hours of his life. Since then, every public development has been examined from multiple angles. Witness interviews have been compared, public statements have been revisited, audio recordings have been analyzed, documents have circulated online. Each new piece of information has generated another round of questions from a community still searching for answers. But throughout that process, one important distinction must remain at the center of the conversation. Questions are not evidence. Online theories are not investigative findings, and speculation should never replace the facts. That is especially important in a case involving young people whose names have become part of a national conversation before investigators have publicly explained every detail of what occurred. What we do know is that Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island with a large group of friends on July 4th. At some point during the day, the group became separated. Nolan did not return home. Search efforts began, and his body was later recovered. Since then, multiple agencies have continued investigating the circumstances surrounding his death, while forensic testing and other investigative steps have proceeded through the legal process. We also know that the investigation has remained active. Law enforcement officials and prosecutors have repeatedly indicated that they cannot publicly discuss every aspect of an ongoing case. While that has understandably frustrated many people following the investigation, protecting the integrity of the process is essential if future legal proceedings are to be fair and based on reliable evidence. As more information has entered the public domain, attention has expanded beyond the original timeline. Social media discussions have focused on photographs, interviews, digital evidence, voting records, and witness recollections. Some of those discussions have raised legitimate questions about chronology and consistency. Others have relied on assumptions that have not been publicly verified. One example is the widespread discussion surrounding a recently circulated photograph involving members of the group. The image quickly became the subject of online debate, with many attempting to interpret what it might reveal about relationships within the friend group. However, investigators have not publicly stated that the photograph establishes a romantic relationship, identifies a motive, or changes the direction of the investigation. Without corroborating evidence, it should not be treated as proof of any particular theory. That same principle applies to the emergency voting call that has been analyzed by countless listeners online. While many people believe they hear specific words or names in the recording, officials have not publicly confirmed many of those interpretations. Audio analysis can be valuable, but it must be evaluated alongside the full body of evidence rather than in isolation. Cases like this often remind us how quickly public narratives can develop in the digital age. Information travels almost instantly. Clips are shared out of context. Opinions become headlines. Before long, separating verified facts from assumptions becomes one of the greatest challenges facing both investigators and the public. For Nolan's family, however, this case has never been about internet debates. It has always been about finding the truth. Every unanswered question represents another piece of a puzzle they hope will eventually be completed. Every official update matters because it brings them one step closer to understanding what happened to their son, their family member, and someone whose future was cut tragically short. Until investigators complete their work, many of the questions surrounding July 4th will remain exactly that. Questions. Who last saw Nolan? Can every movement that day be accurately reconstructed? Will additional digital evidence clarify the timeline? Will future investigative findings answer the questions that continue to circulate throughout the community? Only the evidence can provide those answers. As more verified information becomes available, we'll continue following this case carefully, separating confirmed developments from speculation and focusing on facts rather than rumors. If you've watched all the way to the end, thank you for spending your time with us. Cases like this deserve careful attention, thoughtful discussion, and respect for everyone affected. If you found this breakdown informative, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Brian Case Records, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates as this investigation continues. Your support helps us continue producing fact-based true crime documentaries that prioritize accuracy over speculation. And finally, we'd like to hear from you. Based only on the documented information that has been made public so far, what question do you believe investigators most need to answer next? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Thank you for watching Brian Case Records. We'll continue following this case closely and will bring you any significant verified developments as they become available. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember that every investigation deserves patience, fairness, and a commitment to the truth.